What happens when a place sold as a symbol of victory starts feeling more like a trap people are desperate to escape? Because that is the fear now hanging over Crimea, where blackouts, fuel shortages, bridge queues, and growing panic are turning Putin's showcase peninsula into a slow public humiliation. Before we go any further, hit like if you want clear war analysis without the noise, subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown, and share this video with one person who still thinks Crimea is stable. For years, Crimea was supposed to be the proof that Russia could seize territory, hold it, pour money into it, and then present it back to the world as a success story. It was meant to look modern, secure, loyal, permanent. It was meant to be the jewel in Vladimir Putin's imperial crown, the place he could point to and say, "See, this is how history can be reversed." But wars have a cruel way of exposing the gap between propaganda and reality. And right now, that gap in Crimea is getting harder to hide, because the story coming out of the peninsula is no longer just about occasional strikes or nervous summer tourists. It is about systems breaking down. It is about daily life getting harder. It is about long lines at the bridge, empty shelves in shops, bans on fuel sales to ordinary people, repeated power outages, and a growing sense that Crimea is becoming harder to live in, harder to supply, and harder to defend. That is why the story matters. Not because Crimea has already fallen, it is not, but because the peninsula now looks less like a fortress and more like a pressure chamber, and that pressure is visible in places people understand instantly. CNN reported in late June that Russian-installed authorities declared a state of emergency in Crimea as intensified Ukrainian strikes led to widespread power outages and fuel shortages. Blackouts hit Sevastopol for days. Repair work to the power grid was suspended during air raid alerts. Fuel was restricted to government agencies and cut off from ordinary residents and businesses. That is not a picture of normal life. That is the picture of a region under strain. Then, look at the bridge. CNN reported that queues built up for the crossing between Crimea and southern Russia, with the number peaking at 2,800 vehicles waiting to leave after the Kerch Strait crossing was temporarily closed following an overnight drone attack. Nearly twice as many cars were trying to leave Crimea as to enter. That single detail says a lot. When more people want out than in, fear has already entered the calculation. And fear changes everything. It changes how people shop. It changes how they travel. It changes whether they open a business, keep a business, or try to sell one. It changes whether they stay for the season or leave early. It changes whether a family says, "This is annoying," or starts saying, "We need a plan." That shift matters because large political collapse rarely begins with one dramatic speech. It begins when ordinary people stop trusting the future where they are. That is what makes Crimea so important in this phase of the war. This is not just any occupied territory. Crimea has always carried emotional and strategic weight for Moscow. It's tied to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, to tourism, to domestic propaganda, to military logistics, and to Putin's personal mythology. Losing control of the story there would not only be a military problem, it would be a political wound, a symbolic wound, a humiliation visible to millions of Russians. And humiliation is the word hanging over this whole picture. Because Crimea was never sold to Russian audiences as a burden. It was sold as a triumph, a sacred gain, a permanent achievement, a place supposedly brought back into the Russian fold forever. But now reports from the peninsula describe something much darker. Fuel shortages, repeated bridge closures, blackouts, empty roads in some cities, empty supermarket shelves in some neighborhoods, summer camps suspended, residents and tourists waiting in heat for hours just to cross the bridge. These are not the images of a secure jewel. These are the images of a territory being slowly squeezed. That squeeze has a physical form: roads, fuel, power, communications, and transport. RFE/RL reported that Ukrainian strikes on infrastructure and shipping created a severe blockade effect in Russian-occupied Crimea, leading to acute fuel shortages, widespread blackouts, communications problems, and a collapsed tourism season in parts of the peninsula. Residents described having no power, no signal, and almost no mobile internet. Some tourists who had arrived by car were left without enough gasoline to leave. That detail is more than inconvenient. It is psychological. When even your exit feels uncertain, a holiday zone stops feeling like a holiday zone. And then there are the scenes on the bridge itself. Medusa summarized reporting from Crimea, showing that repeated closures of the Kerch Bridge during attack alerts had turned it into a bottleneck. On August 7th, nearly 3,500 vehicles backed up on both sides. Wait times stretched past 5 hours on the Taman side and more than 3 hours on the Kerch side. On another night, the backup reached 41 kilometers. Think about that image. Families with kids, drivers stuck in summer heat, not enough drinking water, not enough toilets, people sitting for hours under the threat of attack just to cross the one route that still feels like a lifeline. That is not just traffic. That is a message. The message is simple. Crimea is not cut off completely, but it is no longer comfortably connected either. And that middle condition may be the most frightening of all, because complete isolation would at least be clear. What Crimea has instead is repeated disruption. Open, then closed. Working, then not working. Fuel available, then not available. Power on, then off. That rhythm wears people down. It destroys confidence long before it destroys infrastructure. Now, let's talk about the phrase in the title. 1 million Russians flee. We need to be careful and serious here. Public reporting on exact numbers is messy, political, and often impossible to verify in real time. Different sources give different figures for how many Russians moved to Crimea after 2014. Some estimates are far lower. Some Ukrainian estimates are much higher. What is easier to verify is the direction of movement and the atmosphere now surrounding it. Reports describe more people trying to leave, more families reconsidering whether to stay, and more pressure building on those who once believed Crimea was the safest piece of occupied territory. So the core truth is not that we have a perfect census in our hands. The core truth is that exit behavior is becoming visible. CNN reported that nearly twice as many cars were trying to leave Crimea as to enter during one major bridge backup. RFE-RRL described an apparent exodus of tourists and locals amid shortages and blackouts. Medusa described repeated hours-long waits and growing frustration from drivers stranded in brutal summer conditions. Those are not rumors floating in empty space. They are signs of a territory where confidence is thinning. And confidence matters more than people think. Occupation systems are not held together only by force. They are also held together by routine, by paychecks arriving, by roads staying open, by lights turning on, by food reaching stores, by schools, and camps and transport and banking and tourism continuing just well enough that people can tell themselves life goes on. Once routine starts breaking down, people begin to make private decisions long before governments admit there is a crisis. They stop investing. They sell early. They leave quietly. They warn relatives not to come. They shorten trips. They hide cash. They prepare to move. This is why reports about summer camps being suspended matter. CNN noted that the Russian-installed head of Crimea announced all children's camps would be suspended until September 1st. On paper, that may sound like an administrative measure. In reality, it tells families something deeper. It says the authorities do not trust the situation enough to keep children's programs running normally. Once parents hear that, many stop asking whether the season can be saved and start asking whether the place is still safe for their kids. And parents are always among the first people to change the temperature of a place. A single businessman may stay for money. A tourist may gamble on a short trip. But when families begin to think, this is not safe for children, the emotional tide shifts much faster. That matters because Crimea has always depended on two kinds of belief at once. The first is the state's belief that it can govern and defend the peninsula. The second is the public's belief that daily life there remains worth the risk. If either one weakens, the whole structure feels shakier. If both weaken at the same time, the effect can be dramatic. Quick pause. If this video is helping you connect the dots, hit like, subscribe for the next update, and share it with one person who still thinks Crimea is secure. The energy story shows exactly how that happens. CNN reported that Sevastopol had suffered repeated blackouts and that repair work was delayed by air raid alerts. RFE-RL described sweeping outages across much of the peninsula after drone strikes on the electricity grid. One resident said there was no power, no signal, and effectively no mobile internet. Once electricity goes unstable, the damage spreads beyond darkness. Refrigeration fails. Businesses lose stock, water. Pumping becomes uncertain. Online payments become harder. Traffic lights fail. Phones stop charging. People cannot plan their day because the grid itself feels unreliable. And unreliable systems create a very specific kind of fear. Not the sudden fear of one explosion, but the slow fear of not knowing what will still work tomorrow. Will the store open? Will the fuel station have anything? Will the bus still run? Will the bridge close again? Will the lights come back tonight? That sort of uncertainty drains morale in a different way. It makes normal life feel expensive, exhausting, and strangely temporary. This is also why fuel shortages are so destabilizing. CNN reported that fuel was reserved for government agencies and not for ordinary people or businesses. One resident said there was no fuel at gas stations and that the fuel she had bought earlier cost much more than before. RFE.RL reported that fuel had become increasingly scarce, with some locals saying there was practically none left even at high prices. Fuel shortages do not remain a transport issue for long. They become a work issue, a supply issue, a food issue, and a survival issue. Taxis slow down, deliveries slow down, refrigerated goods spoil, farmers struggle. Small businesses begin doing terrible math. That terrible math is one of the most important parts of this story. Because collapse, if it comes, is rarely one dramatic military event. It is often a chain reaction in which each problem multiplies another. Fuel shortages make transport harder. Trouble makes food delivery harder. Power outages make refrigeration harder. Bridge closures make restocking slower. Communications disruptions make business coordination weaker. Tourism falls, revenue drops. Then businesses cut staff, reduce hours, or close entirely. At that point, even people who once wanted to tough it out start to wonder if staying makes any sense. We have already seen hints of this social chain reaction in the reporting. CNN quoted residents asking how they were supposed to work, support their families, pay loans, transport perishable goods, or even fit onto overloaded public transport when fuel and electricity failed at the same time. These are not battlefield complaints. These are daily life complaints. And daily life complaints are what turn a strategic problem into a political one. That is the central tension here. Ukraine is trying to make Crimea harder for Russia to use militarily. But the pressure does not stop at military targets. It spreads outward into the systems that make the peninsula livable. Russia then faces a painful choice: divert more resources to keep Crimea functioning and admit it is in trouble, or minimize the crisis and risk letting public confidence keep draining away. Neither option is comfortable, and that is why the phrase total isolation resonates, even if it is not yet absolute in a literal sense. Crimea is not hermetically sealed off. The bridge still functions at times. Trains still move at times. Supplies still come through, though under growing strain. But the broader feeling is one of narrowing connection. More delay, more inspection, more closures, more unpredictability. A place does not need to be fully cut off to feel isolated. It only needs enough uncertainty that people start thinking, if things get worse, can I still get out? Now let's go deeper into why Crimea matters so much to both sides. For Russia, Crimea is not only a strategic asset, it is a political story. It anchors Kremlin messaging about history, legitimacy, and restored power. It supports naval operations through Sevastopol. It connects to logistics in the south. It serves as a domestic symbol that the annexation of 2014 was not a gamble, but a triumph. Every one of those functions matters. But the danger for Moscow is that symbols are powerful only as long as reality keeps feeding them. Once reality starts contradicting the symbol can become a liability. That is exactly what may be happening now. Instead of looking like a secure Russian success, Crimea is beginning to look like a territory that consumes constant resources while growing harder to defend and harder to sell as normal. That is a terrible combination for the Kremlin. A showcase that requires excuses every week stops being a showcase. A victory that needs emergency management starts looking very different to the people living inside it. For Ukraine, the logic is almost the mirror image. Kiev does not need to recapture Crimea tomorrow to make it costly for Russia. It can raise the cost of occupation by targeting infrastructure, logistics, shipping, power, and transport links. CNN reported that Ukraine is systematically targeting key transport links and supply routes connecting the peninsula to southern Russian forces, aiming to disrupt logistics and isolate military infrastructure there. That is the strategic core. Make Crimea less useful, make it more expensive, make it less stable, force Russia to defend a place that was supposed to advertise Russian strength. This explains why the bridge matters so much. The Kerch Bridge is not just concrete and steel, it is a lifeline and a symbol. It physically links Crimea to Russia. It also psychologically reassures people that the peninsula remains connected to the mainland. When the bridge closes repeatedly during attack alerts, or when waits stretch for hours, the damage is not only logistical, it is emotional. Every closure whispers the same thing. This link is vulnerable. And once a lifeline starts looking vulnerable, fear spreads much faster than shortages alone. Medusa's reporting captures that civilian pressure with brutal clarity. Drivers were told to bring water and snacks because waits could stretch past 6 hours. People complained about the lack of toilets, the heat, and the risk to children. One local described using a plastic bottle after sitting in traffic for 4 hours. Another warned that people were risking their health just to reach a place where explosions could be heard every day. These are the details that make a geopolitical story real. They show what isolation feels like in human terms. And human terms matter, because they shape decisions. A government can say the situation is under control. But if mothers, drivers, shop owners, market vendors, and hotel operators all start experiencing the same breakdown from different angles, the official story loses power. People trust what they live. If they live blackouts, they believe blackouts. If they live shortages, they believe shortages. If they live long exit lines, they believe exit lines. That is how political narratives erode from below. Tourism is another part of that erosion. Crimea has long depended on being presented as a resort, as well as a military prize. But RFE-RL described the tourist industry as devastated in some areas, with beaches largely empty and hotels struggling. CNN reported that a guesthouse owner still saw guests arriving and described the mood as cautious rather than panicked, which is important because it shows the situation is not uniform everywhere. Some people still come. Some cafes still function. Some beaches still open. That nuance matters. But the broader point remains. Tourism economy built on confidence suffers quickly when air raid alerts, bridge closures, and fuel shortages become routine. And routine is the key word. Almost any place can survive a single dramatic week. What breaks confidence is repetition. Another outage, another closure, another shortage, another queue, another warning, another summer camp suspension, another empty shelf, another rumor that fuel is only for state agencies, another day where the public has to improvise around systems that no longer feel reliable. By the time outsiders start saying crisis, residents may already be living in adaptation mode. That adaptation mode is its own kind of defeat for the authorities. People start planning around the state instead of trusting the state. They buy extra water. They charge phones whenever power appears. They avoid travel windows. They keep emergency food at home. They warn relatives not to cross the bridge at certain times. They mentally rehearse departure. A government can claim control, but the public's behavior reveals what they really believe. This is why stories of property sales and quiet departures matter, even when exact. Totals are hard to confirm. Large migrations do not begin with a census release. They begin with a shift in behavior, more for sale listings, more relatives returning to the mainland, more officials quietly moving family members out, more seasonal workers deciding not to come back, more tourists choosing another destination, more business owners saying the risk is no longer worth it. Those are the early sounds of a place becoming thinner. And if you want more clear, no-hype reporting like this, tap like now, subscribe so you stay ahead of the next shift, and share this video with a friend who follows the war closely. And Crimea may be getting thinner in exactly that way. Even where life continues, it is doing so under heavier strain. CNN showed both sides of this clearly. Elderly women still swimming at beaches, young people still trying to live normally, but also repeated blackouts, emergency measures, and long lines to leave. That tension matters. It tells us Crimea is not in one simple state. It is neither normal nor fully collapsed. It is trapped in between. And being trapped in between may be the most politically dangerous phase. Because in that phase, expectations still matter. People can tolerate hardship if they believe it is temporary. They become much less patient when they suspect it may be the new normal. If residents begin to think this winter could bring more outages, less heating, more transport disruption, and even tighter fuel supply, then today's stress becomes tomorrow's departure plan. That is when an exodus stops being a headline and becomes a process. Now let's confront the hardest question. Is Crimea truly collapsing, or are we watching a severe but survivable crisis? The honest answer is that collapse is not a switch. It is a spectrum. Crimea is still under Russian control. There is no Ukrainian ground offensive rolling into Sevastopol tomorrow. Moscow can still pour money into the peninsula. Some trains still run. Some beaches still function. Some tourists still arrive. That is real. But it is also real that blackouts, shortages, closures, and repeated strikes are degrading the confidence that Russia spent more than a decade trying to build. That distinction matters because propaganda often works by forcing a false choice. Either everything is fine, or total disaster has already arrived. Real life is usually messier. A system can be intact enough to survive, and broken enough to bleed trust at the same time. That may be the best description of Crimea right now. Not a place already gone, but a place under growing strain where each week of disruption makes the next week harder. And if that strain continues, the social consequences could become more serious than the physical damage itself. Political systems fear visible panic, but they fear quiet preparation even more. Quiet preparation spreads silently. It does not always protest. It does not always shout. It simply leaves, sells, withholds investment, or stops believing official promises. That is why the travel numbers, bridge queues, and household frustrations are so important. They tell us how confidence is moving. The most dangerous thing for Moscow may be that this pressure is happening in the one place it most wanted to present as unquestionably secure. If similar disruption hits a faraway region inside Russia, it is embarrassing. If it hits Crimea, it strikes straight at Putin's legacy. Every blackout there is larger than a blackout. Every queue is larger than a queue. Every shortage becomes a question. If this territory was so successfully integrated, why does it look this fragile under pressure? That is why the Kremlin cannot easily shrug this off. It may still stabilize parts of the peninsula. It may subsidize fuel. It may route more resources into the grid. It may harden certain sites. It may keep showcase cities functioning better than rural districts. But all those measures come with a cost. financial cost, military cost, political cost, and each emergency repair is still a confession that the normal model is failing. CNN captured this contradiction well. Some residents described empty roads, empty shelves, overloaded transport, and fear. Yet others still saw cafes, beaches, and guests. That split picture does not weaken the case that Crimea is under strain. It strengthens it, because it shows authorities are fighting to preserve islands of normality while the broader environment grows shakier. That is exactly what a stressed occupation looks like before it tips into something worse. And remember, Ukraine does not need instant collapse to gain from this. If Crimea becomes harder to supply, harder to use as a rear base, harder to market, and harder to govern, that already serves Ukrainian strategy. An occupied peninsula under permanent logistical and psychological stress is much less valuable to Russia than one that feels secure and profitable. This is where the human cost intersects with military logic in uncomfortable ways. Civilians pay for the pressure, families sit in traffic for hours, shop owners lose stock, workers struggle to commute, elderly residents face outages, tourists get stranded. That suffering is real, but from a purely strategic perspective, the pressure is aimed at turning the Russian occupation into a burden rather than a prize. That is why this campaign feels so brutal. Its power lies not in one spectacular strike, but in repeated strain. Repeated strain also shapes morale inside Russian institutions. Imagine being a local administrator, tasked with telling the public the situation is controlled while fuel is restricted, bridge traffic keeps backing up, and blackout schedules stretch for days. Imagine trying to reassure businesses when you cannot tell them whether transport will work or when the next alert will shut a route down again. Imagine trying to maintain the image of a stable, proudly Russian peninsula when people are lining up to get out. That is a political nightmare. And political nightmares inside authoritarian systems often produce two instincts at once. First, concealment. Downplay the damage. Minimize the panic. Blame sabotage, enemies, or temporary repair issues. Second, scapegoating. Find officials to blame. Remove some faces. Promise new discipline. Pretend the problem was local incompetence rather than structural vulnerability. Crimea's history under Russian rule makes that pattern entirely believable. But scapegoats do not restore fuel, power, or trust on their own. They only buy time. And time is what this whole battle is really about. Can Russia buy enough time to keep Crimea functioning through another difficult season? Can Ukraine keep raising the cost faster than Moscow can stabilize the peninsula? Can residents endure another winter if the systems stay this shaky? These are the questions that matter now. There is another layer to this that often gets missed. The more pressure Crimea experiences, the more selective the authorities may become about who gets protected first. Strategic sites, military needs, key cities, and showcase districts may be prioritized while ordinary civilians absorb more of the outage burden. That kind of uneven protection can keep essential state functions going for a while, but it also breeds bitterness. People notice when some places stay brighter, warmer, and better supplied than others. And bitterness is poison for occupation legitimacy. You can frighten people into silence for a long time. It is much harder to make them feel loyal when they believe they are the ones paying for the state's failure. Even quiet bitterness changes behavior. It reduces cooperation. It feeds private anger. It makes people less willing to sacrifice. It makes exit more attractive. And that is why I think the most important word in this entire story is not collapse. It is isolation. Isolation of the peninsula from stable supply. Isolation of residents from certainty. Isolation of Moscow from its own propaganda. Isolation of the occupation administration from believable promises. Isolation of Crimea from the easy assumption that it can remain Russia's untouchable prize, no matter how the broader war develops. And total isolation, in political terms, does not mean every road is closed forever. It means the place begins to feel cut off from predictability, from security, and from the future it was promised. That is the mood now creeping into Crimea. Before we land this, do one quick thing for me. Like the video, subscribe, if you want the next phase explained clearly, and share it with someone who still believes Crimea is just a frozen front with no real movement. So where does this go from here? There are a few realistic paths. The first is managed deterioration. Moscow keeps the peninsula afloat through subsidies, selective protection, emergency, repairs, rationing, and heavy security. Life gets harder, but not hard enough to trigger a dramatic break. In that scenario, Crimea becomes a permanently stressed zone, not collapsing fast, but decaying slowly. The second path is pre-winter acceleration. More strikes, more power trouble, more bridge closures, more shortages, more people deciding not to stay for another season of uncertainty. If that happens, the current trickle of departure could become something much larger, especially among families, business owners, and anyone who has a practical alternative on the mainland. The third path is political hardening. If Moscow feels confidence collapsing, it may answer not with comfort, but with control, more security, more restrictions, more pressure on information, more visible discipline from local authorities. That kind of response can suppress panic in the short term, but it rarely rebuilds trust. It only tells the public the state is more afraid than it wants to admit. And then there is the long shadow of winter, summer. Shortages are serious. Winter shortages are political. Heat, electricity, fuel, food deliveries, and basic services matter more when temperatures drop. A hot queue at the bridge is miserable. A cold apartment in repeated blackouts is something else entirely. If Crimea enters winter without a much stronger sense of stability, the psychological pressure could rise sharply. That is why the next few months matter so much. Not because a dramatic announcement will settle everything, but because habits will harden. Either residents will start believing the worst phase is passing, or they will start planning around the idea that this is what life in Crimea has become. Once the second belief takes hold, departures tend to multiply. And that brings us back to the title, Putin's Crimea Collapses. Has it fully collapsed? No, not yet. But the version of Crimea sold by Kremlin propaganda is collapsing in plain sight. The image of a secure, prosperous, permanently stabilized jewel is giving way to a very different reality. Emergency rule, bridge panic, fuel scarcity, fragile utilities, nervous tourists, and a growing awareness that the peninsula can no longer be treated as untouchable. That symbolic collapse matters because symbols were doing enormous work for Moscow here. Crimea was meant to prove annexation could be normalized. It was meant to prove time favored Russia. It was meant to prove that what was taken could be held, polished, and made profitable. Instead, what we now see is a territory becoming more expensive, more nervous, and more vulnerable the longer the war grinds on. And for Putin, that may be the cruelest twist of all. The place he used to showcase strength may become the place where weakness is easiest to see. Not necessarily because Russian troops are gone, but because ordinary life is becoming so hard to maintain that even the propaganda cannot hide the cracks. When residents ration fuel, when families queue for hours to leave, when children's camps close, when blackouts become routine, and when the bridge itself feels like a gamble, the myth of stability starts dying. That is why this is bigger than a regional crisis. Crimea sits at the intersection of military, logistics, domestic propaganda, occupation economics, and public psychology. When pressure rises there, the consequences travel far beyond the peninsula. They reach Moscow's narrative about the war. They reach the confidence of settlers, soldiers' families, and administrators. They reach every Russian who was told this territory was secure forever. So no, we should not rush into cartoonish predictions. We should not pretend tomorrow brings instant liberation or overnight implosion, but we also should not miss what is already happening. Crimea is getting darker, harder to supply, harder to sell, harder to govern, harder to trust. And once a place becomes hard to trust, it starts to empty long before any official admits it. That may be the real evacuation plan now taking shape. Not one giant order, not one dramatic convoy, but 1,000 private decisions made under pressure. One family at a time, one business at a time, one tourist at a time, one official quietly moving valuables at a time, one resident deciding they do not want to spend another winter hoping the lights come back. And if that process keeps growing, then the most dangerous thing for the Kremlin will not be a single strike. It will be the slow realization that Crimea is no longer radiating power. It is radiating doubt. That doubt is contagious. It spreads from bridge lines to supermarket shelves, from outage schedules to hotel bookings, from telegram complaints to quiet exit plans. And once doubt becomes the dominant emotion in a place built on political theater, the theater starts failing. In the end, that may be what total isolation really means here. Not just a peninsula under physical pressure, but a political trophy cut off from the confidence that once made it useful. A place still occupied, still defended, still subsidized, but no longer convincing as a success story. A place where the cost of staying rises while the promise that once justified staying fades. And if that continues, then Putin's biggest problem in Crimea may not be what Ukraine destroys next. It may be what more and more people have already started to understand. When a showcase territory stops feeling like home and starts feeling like a trap, the collapse begins long before the flag changes.